Hi, my name's Dr. Colin Robertson, and I'm a scientific research specialist here at Zinzino. And first of all, I'd like to apologize for not being able to be with you in person. That's always my preference, so that I can field questions live and deal with any kind of concerns or any level of debate that people like to bring up. But unfortunately, I'm not able to do that at the moment. So hopefully I'll be able to cover most of what it is that you might be interested in the context of really those omega-3s and how they feature within high performance. And particularly, really what we're going to discuss is how that fits within recovery, because that's where most of the research sits around the specific benefits there are to be had from having a sufficient amount of omega-3 within the system available and how it facilitates enhanced recovery. Before I do so, really, I think it's important to state my background. Really, I started off over 27 years ago now, and most of my time, early days, was spent as a strength and conditioning coach. I was head of performance for Rugby League Ireland, took the team off to the 2008 World Cup in Australia. I was also head of strength and conditioning and performance for Widnes Vikings Rugby League. I've worked on a lot of projects and a lot of collaborations, spent a long time with the England FA, working with both the female team as a strength and conditioning coach and exercise physiologist, also working with some of the disability teams and sports within that setup. But I've worked as an S&C coach and exercise physiologist across multiple sports, supporting athletes who are going to the Olympics in Beijing, London, Rio, and also the qualifying rounds for such events. I'm an environmental physiologist, so a lot of my time is spent preparing individuals who are going to go into extreme environments and conditions, everything from rowing across the Atlantic to reaching the summit of Everest, marathon dressage. And I've become something of a little bit of an endurance specialist over the past 10 to 15 years, supporting and working with a lot of athletes who are taking part in the World Championships for Ironman events, ultrathons, and really I've worked with athletes on every single continent with the exception of Antarctica. However, just recently, as I record this now, we're in March 2021, a project has come my way in which I'm going to be able to tick that box and support people going into that environment, which I'm thrilled about. So much of what I've done, although I've worked a lot in the health space, has been married to a real interest and a lot of activity within the fitness space and the high performance sport space, taking people towards medals at the biggest games in the world, successful completions of adventures in tough environments, and drill down a lot of time, I guess, in those full contact sports. I think it's important that it's important that you know that and we cover that, because a lot of what we embed in high performance practice has to go through the rigors of research. We have to we have to have it confirmed that we're working off best evidence that informs best practice. And that's always been important to me, even as I've evolved now in more of a research role, certainly over the past 10 years, with numbers of my students, my PhD students working in high level sport, being based at football clubs and rugby clubs, done a lot of work in fatigue. And a lot of my PhD students who've completed and gone on to success have done work in and around fatigue. And that's really where the door opened for me, looking at the nutritional component of how we deal with fatigue. I'm also a registered nutritionist with the British Dietetics Association, registered as a sports nutritionist. And in fact, my master's degree, which feels like a long time ago now, was actually in nutrition and exercise physiology. So I've always had a passion and an interest in that. And I've always been drawn towards the impact that better dietary choices can make on our performance and then on our recovery. Because as anyone who works in the fitness space knows, anyone who's working in high performance sport, we are only as good as we recover. That's the fact. The training is important. Of course it is. The type of stimulus that we provide is really important. Our exercise stimulus, our time on task, our intensity, those specific when it comes to skill acquisition, and then those more physical characteristics of developing strength, power, speed, endurance. You know, there's a definite art and science to getting that right. But we can undermine all of that. We can make it a waste of time if we don't get our recovery right. You know, recovery is the key attribute towards increased success and long-term participation for our athletes. You know, we're trying to avoid burnout. We're trying to create athletes that are in a better ready state to train and to perform as consistently as they have to. So whilst looking at kind of active recovery methods, typical stuff that we would do, you know, things like recovery sessions, whether that's weighted, non-weighted, pool work, massage, you know, those kind of typical therapies and practices that we engage in. Food is everything. Nutrition is such a high part of it. You know, it directly influences how we remodel and repair. And so a long time ago, I started to go down that route of looking at those epigenetic factors. So those foods that bring about a positive impact and a change of gene expression, because, you know, we know that 50% of our inherited genes makes a huge difference on who and what we are and how we perform. But that other 50%, and in fact, there's a lot of research now that suggests it's actually more than 50%, is about how we behave and how we engage and what we do and what we consume. So I was a long time ago, I went down this road and quite quickly came upon the notion of the vital importance of the omegas within that setup, and that understanding of, one, how the typical diet functions, what's available with regards to food choices, food availability, and then nutrient availability that's based in those foods. And as anyone who's working in this space, you know, whether it's the other part of my role, which is more clinical and public health, and we're trying to bring about, you know, food behavior changes and optimize them, or when you're managing athletes and you have far more influence, really, and someone who's far more motivated to engage in practices that are going to get them that 1% in 100 different areas. Whenever we're dealing with this, it's always that factor of what a person's psychological attachment and emotional attachment is to food, the types of foods they prefer, the type of foods that they see as a comfort or a reward, and then typically what makes up for their overall nutrient profile. A lot of people get drawn towards the energy components, the calorific aspect of it, which is important, obviously, but nutrient availability and nutrient content is every bit as important, because it's the quality of those nutrients that have a direct impact on our immune system, our immune response, our inflammatory response, that acute versus chronic, and then how the body literally repairs on the go. All of this is directly influenced by that nutrient availability. And that's before we even get to the gut and the gut biome. And there's a ton of work that's been done over the past 20 years that's really looked at how the stomach is the center of our universe. And that if we're not considering that and addressing that with those kind of prebiotics and probiotics with regards to how we preserve, optimize that environment so that we can get the right amount, the right level and rate of absorption, so that we can draw off all these macro and micronutrients and use them to best effect. Well, when we start to work through all that, we very quickly get to the cellular level, because at the end of the day, that's what we are. We are, each of us, we are a combination. If we strip physiology right down to some of its smallest component parts, we are a collection of billions of cells that come together for a lifetime before, you know, it dissipates. Everybody knows that once we're born and we are developing, you know, we are growing and maturing, and then we reach about age 21, 22, and then we're maturing, we're aging, you know, we go into the aging cycle. And from a cellular point of view, the difference there is the slowdown in the rate of that cellular turnover, and then the amount. And these are the changes that we see in our skin and in the color of our hair and all these things that change as we age. Normal part of our maturation cycle, our life cycle. But we know we can best manage and preserve those cells so that our chronological age matches our biological age. We want to keep them as closely as we possibly can. We don't want to advance the aging process. And I know some people are fascinated with the fountain of eternal youth, but I think it's just really good if you can keep those two things in line so that your chronological age matches your biological age. But then when we look at cellular processes with regards to controlling the way in which our body is responding to our physical training, to our exercise training stimulus and our exercise performance, well, we know that we need the acute inflammatory response. That's what triggers the body to engage in adaptive processes. So that's vital to us. And those omega-6s, which we're going to come back to in a minute, we'll consider the omegas in a second. Those omega-6s play a vital part in that. But that more what's referred to as chronic, that longer lasting inflammatory status, has no benefit to us whatsoever. And typically that's brought about by, well, numerous things. Lifestyle factors can influence that, but they don't typically come in so much when we're dealing with athletic populations. But certainly certain types of food choices and food availabilities, and certainly if something's deficient within the diet. So all of our understanding has moved forward, and we know that at a cellular level, this ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 is really important. And it makes perfect sense. The whole biologically, we are working to a level of homeostasis constantly. Our body is permanently on this, shifting towards this dynamic state of maintaining equilibrium, whether that's hormonal processes, physiological processes, even to a certain extent, psychophysiological processes. And so within the cell, we see that this ratio between the omega-3 and the omega-6 is really important with regards to numerous things, but certainly with regards to controlling the inflammatory status and with regards to the actual integrity of the cell itself, keeping the cell soft and malleable so that those essential nutrients can get in and the toxins can get out. So this is really important with just regards to our general function and our health. And there is a ton of research out there that's looked at this in the context of various types of disease conditions and health status, all of which generally agree that the ratio is important. Whether or not it is something that is remedial or not is contested in certain areas. There are certain conditions where it has a huge impact and others where not so much from a remedial point of view, but it's encouraged with regards to the notion of maintaining and preserving the normal healthy status of the cell. So that doesn't necessarily make it therapeutic. So we've got our omega-3 and our omega-6. Let's consider those for a moment. Omega-6, widely available. In fact, the average Western industrialized diet has too much access to it. It's in a lot of the foods that we consume and eat. It's so easy that the vast majority of people eat too much. Okay, that's really important. And this is our exogenous omega-6, what we consume, what we eat. It's available from, it's all around us. Our omega-3s, less so. Dietary behaviors have shifted and changed, and actually availability has been impacted on this. And our omega-3s are those marine omegas. Okay, so we're looking at the DHA and the EPA. This is really important when we start to consider things like that control of inflammatory status, when we start to consider things like immune function, and also when we look at brain development and behavior. Those DHA and EPA come into their own. We can only get them from marine sources. We can get them from sea algae, and we can get them from really good quality fatty fish. So our diets have changed a lot. The average person living in Western industrialized world, certainly, main continent, Europe, UK, United States, Australia, overall, there's been, even in the Scandinavian countries now, there's been this gradual shift away from a diet that's rich in those kinds of sources. And even what is available to most people, unfortunately, is at the kind of rough end of the aquaculture industry. So intensively farmed fish that are fed a certain type of feed, kept in these equivalent of big pens, lower nutrient density. So we need really good quality line caught wild fatty fish. So we're looking at our sardines, and we're looking at salmon, and those really good quality fatty fish. We've got 7.8 billion people living on the planet. We could all benefit really from eating really good quality fatty fish 3 to 4 to 5 times per week. It's not ecologically sustainable. It's not financially realistic for most people. Off the back of that notion, a long time ago, the fish oil industry kicked off, and it made good sense. But where it made good sense, it lacked real impact, because the processing alone of drawing off the fish oil, this left the omega-3s somewhat vulnerable, and they're sensitive to heat. They're detached from the polyphenol, which they'd normally be bound to in a more natural state. And we know that the air has a negative effect on that. Literally, in some instances, it's fair to say that it starts to make it a little bit rancid and toxic. And then when we start to ingest it, well, the temperature of our body, this isolated omega-3 is further influenced and harmed as it passes through the small intestine into the gut, and then very little gets out. And that's why the fish oil industry doesn't hit the mark. Very little of it actually gets through to make a change within the cell. And again, there's a ton of research out there that evidences that. So we've got this real problem, which is that there's low availability through the diet, and the common solution, which is the fish oil, doesn't hit the mark. But let's just pause there for a moment. We've considered the fact that omega-6s are widely available. Omega-6s are vital to us in the instance of the acute inflammatory response, which we want. And it's our omega-3s that really control the cellular inflammation and certainly manage that chronic inflammation. And the two combine to be really powerful when they're at the right ratio. And we need our omega-3s to be above 8% as a total, but within the cell, we want omega-6 to 3 to be less than 4 to 1. So we've talked about exogenous, so consuming these things. Endogenously, so when the omega-3 is in the system, well, if there's a sufficient amount above 8% of the omega-3 available, then the omega-3 really acts as the conductor. It takes charge of the situation within the cell. Because a lot of people will say, quite rightly, well, if you're still eating all this omega-6, how can just increasing your omega-3 make a difference? Well, it does. And this is the difference between endogenous and exogenous. Once there is a sufficient amount of the omega-3 within the system, that above 8%, so 4.1% DHA, 4.1, 4.2% EPA, well, then that takes control of the cell. So it starts to act and orchestrate what's happening, okay? And omega-6 kind of is left to do its job, but isn't running the show. So it isn't just firing off on these inflammatory marker processes. And the omega-3 is anti-inflammatory and starts to control and nurture the cell far more effectively. So that's really important to us, that we've got this notion of controlling the unwanted aspects of inflammation that can occur. And those unwanted aspects of inflammation can occur because of exercise training. That increases our inflammatory markers. If someone's dealing with a cough or a cold, there's multiple things that can prompt the inflammatory response. If you get a cut on your hand, if you trip over a step, little things, and that acute one is important, that response. I don't want anyone to think of omega-6s as the bad guy. We eat too many of them, and even if we're going to increase our omega-3, we probably do well to just reduce our omega-6 a little bit. But we know we can go a long way and be really powerful just by increasing our omega-3s, good quality, increased omega-3s. When it comes to exercise and training and recovery, what do we see? Well, if you look across the board, and there's been some great research done in this area, and if there's one researcher I would encourage you to go and read the work of, it's Professor Chris McGlory, who's out in Canada, has done some incredible work over the past 10 or 15 years, and created some really good outputs. But there's a lot of work in this area, because obviously there's a widely recognized importance of recovery when it comes to athletic performance, when it comes to physical performance and adaptation. So what do we see? So when we see a sufficient amount of omega-3, so endogenous, so we've consumed enough, we're above our 8%, and there is enough omega-3 versus the omega-6 within the cell. So we're beneath 4 to 1. Well, after a bout of exercise, we see an increased anabolic response. which is great because that's one of the keys that unlocks the door to a greater muscle morphological response. So we see this, we see a pronounced upregulation of the anabolic phase. So we're already into the grounds of a benefit response from having the right amount of omega-3s. Secondly, and this is really interesting, we see less muscle breakdown. So we see less disruption of the Z line. We see less inflammatory markers. We still see that because that's a vital aspect of the response that we want, and that what triggers that anabolic phase. But really what we're getting here in this instance, and there's a lot of work that's looked at this in quite intense sport, is we see an upregulation of anabolic. So we're going to boost our response, but we see a slight, we see an improved preservation of the muscle breakdown. So we're breaking down less to get more. That's a great scenario to be in. We're losing less to gain more. So rather than a big loss to get a big gain, and that trade-off, which a lot of us have worked in that kind of ratio, either early on in our career or because of the nature of the sport we're dealing with, we're getting this kind of double bubble benefit, increased anabolic and reduced muscle breakdown to achieve it. Brilliant. Another interesting thing that we see is that athletes often report when there is a sufficient amount of omega-3 versus the omega-6 available, decreased perception of muscle soreness and pain after exercise and even during. So this is really powerful, because what we're seeing then is that what can be quite typical and sometimes debilitating for some athletes, but not for most, that sense of muscle soreness, that delayed onset of muscle soreness associated with intense training, well, that reduces. So the athlete is coping better. Their perception of effort and their perception of pain, discomfort afterwards is reduced. We've got a greater anabolic response, and we are getting a better response with regards to the amount of muscle breakdown. So these are the key areas that I would draw your attention to with regards to the benefits of having the optimal range of omega-6/3 within the cell, because these are really powerful with regards to keeping an athlete, one, not only maintaining but continually improving, whether they're in competition phase or in a building phase working towards a peak. These are really powerful things that we can get back. There are other things that have been associated and attributed to it, which we see across the board, and not just in athletic terms. We see people reporting better sleep. That's a real common factor that comes hand in hand when we get this ratio far more aligned to less than 4:1 omega-6 to omega-3 within the cell. So the net outcome of this, as someone who works within elite sports and high performance sports space, is really a no-brainer. By making sure we're getting sufficient amounts of omega-3 on a daily basis, we are amplifying our athletic response. We are amplifying the training response. So we've identified the fact that there's a difficulty in obtaining this through standard dietary practice, although people should consider what they can achieve through their food. Of course they should. But there is a difficulty there. There's a behavioral difficulty, and then it's making sure we're getting the right quality of fish at a sufficient rate. And the fish oil industry doesn't work. So then that brings me around to discussing balance oil. And I always say to people, balance oil, Zinzino's balance oil is not fish oil. When I joined the company, which was the back end of 2020, which is after a long time of looking what Zinzino did and how they did it and understanding their processes, well, the first thing that attracted me to them and made me investigate more and get under the hood and see what Zinzino was about was the notion of the test. So they provided a dry blood spot test in order for you to determine your status with regards to omega-3/6. So that you are previously informed. As someone who's an exercise physiologist, previously the lab directors for the sports science and human performance labs at University of Bolton in Greater Manchester, I'm very test based. If you're not assessing, you're guessing. You want to be able to identify the situation so that you can improve it, or identify the situation to see whether or not it needs to be altered or changed. So I found this was really powerful. It's done at Vitas Labs, which is an independent labs, which has a reputation all of their own. Anybody who works I'd imagine in the exercise physiology space will know of VITAS labs because they're on the map. Lots of places from all over the world use VITAS for these purposes. And I knew they were using the Trondheim red blood cell count analysis with regards to looking at the fatty acid profile. So this all gave me reassurances with regards to the nature of the test itself, so that a person can determine whether or not they have sufficient before they start to consider the need for a product to support it. And then the notion of the retest, because if you're going to test it, if you're going to have a baseline, then surely there's a benefit to then testing to see what improvements there is. That's what we do in research. Any publication in the peer review that has my name against it will have some level of test retest. That's a standard scientific practice. And also because it's 120 days, which we know it takes, the turnover of the red blood cell count is approximately 120 plus minus 10, 15 days. So this gives somebody actually a meaningful period of time to make a change based on a behavioral change and based on increased consumption of the omega-3 through the balance oil. So all of this made perfect sense. But then I thought it's the oil is the interesting part. We've got this test, we've got this real objectivity, but the oil is the interesting part because there's a ton of fish oil that doesn't work. Well, the key attribute to this, this is why I never describe balance oil as a fish oil, is the high quality extra virgin olive oil. So the polyphenol. So right away, we've got the omega-3 encased, protected by the polyphenol. Now, there's not a GP, there's not a doctor in the world that doesn't advise people to just take a teaspoon of extra virgin olive oil every single day because of its anti-inflammatory properties, because of its high polyphenol count. So just by taking the amount we need, we're already winning. Even before we get to the omega-3, we're immersing ourselves in best practice because we're taking a strong dose of anti-inflammatory, high polyphenol, extra virgin olive oil. Win. Then it's got vitamin D in it. So as the world is aware now, I've been telling people for 20 years, take a daily vitamin D. It's vital for the normal functioning of your immune system. If you exercise, you put your immune system under stress every single day. So you should really invest in supporting the normal functioning of your immune system. So, particularly for people, Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere, really, but definitely Northern Hemisphere. The winter months, it should be a given, no matter what. There's no UVB. We're not getting anywhere near enough from the daylight. So we should be taking a vitamin D product to keep our immune system topped up and working away. And the world's come to switch on and realize that because of what's happened currently with the global pandemic. So straight away I saw, well, we've got this real high potency polyphenol. We've got vitamin D. So I'm already starting to enhance my immune status. So I was really happy with that. And then we get to the omega-3 and we get to the omega-9. So because there's actually omega-9 in balance oil as well, but we get the omega-3. And again, the next thing that really made sense to me and rang true is that it was based on a person's weight. It wasn't just a case of this, take this much every single day, no matter who you are. It was based on weight. And that's really important because obviously our body mass makes a huge difference with regards to our required consumption. Because how can we have 8%? How can we achieve that across the board if it's not relative to how much we need to take? Because then anybody who is bigger, and a lot of our athletes are, is going to miss out. They're going to actually be taking something that has the right potency, but not at the right level, not at the right dosage. So then it will be ineffective. So straight away, you could see the intelligence behind the design. There was the test. There was the high polyphenol extra virgin olive oil. There was the vitamin D. And then we're taking the consumption of the omega-3 at a dose that is meaningful to the individual based on their body mass. What I liked about it from a behavioral point of view is it's really, really easy. It doesn't take an overwhelming change of diet and dietary practice. We take a little cup and we drink this every morning. Done. Move on. Next thing that we need to do. And particularly with athletes are great at that kind of behavior. When we start to drill things in and we just make it a given, no more thought required, this much that day, take it, move on, done, done, done. Habits, routines fit really well with athletes. And I was also aware that looking at the wider population, the simplicity of that would work really, really well and start to provide an effective solution. So that was it in a nutshell. We had the right dosage and potency of the omega-3. It was bound in a really high quality polyphenol, which in itself is anti-inflammatory. With regards to how we consume that and their interaction, well, the polyphenol acts as a chaperone. So it protects the omega-3. So those things that we discussed earlier that are the problem with the fish oil industry, well, that doesn't happen here because the omega-3 is bound to a polyphenol. So it doesn't get affected by oxygen or the air. It's not damaged, it's preserved. And then when we consume it, well, we've got the polyphenol acting as an anti-inflammatory. So that's going in and calming things down from the start. It's transporting the omega-3 to where it needs to go so that the omega-3 can act as blocking those pro-inflammatory markers, acting as an anti-inflammatory, and starting to bring about those essential changes to the cell itself. That nice permeability, malleability, letting those nutrients in and getting those toxins out so we can really preserve the cellular status. And then we know that once we are taking sufficient amount of this day by day, we're reaching that 8%. We've got that cellular level ratio of omega-6 to 3 under 4 to 1. Then we know we're in the conditions required to bring about what the research is informing us is there, with that increased anabolic response, that decreased negative impact on the musculature, and that reduced perception of soreness. So we're getting all the health benefit from this, plus we're getting those specific benefits that are associated to people who are in quite an intense training cycle. And we can measure this at the 120-day status for our athletes, for ourselves, across the board now. And the current data set that sits at Zinzino and the Vitas Labs has over 620,000 samples in it. It's the biggest data set of its type in the world. And myself and the rest of the wider scientific advisory board at Zinzino and those academics that we engage with who are outside directly of our board, but who are kind of partnered to us, who really are involved in hotspots of research around this area around the world, have been spending a lot of time analyzing that data. And we see simply by taking this amount consistently across the board, by taking the amount required for the individual, which is 0.15 per kilogram your own body mass. So it's really easy to equate. Once we see a person who's been doing that for the 120 days consistently across the board, over 95% of those people achieve that less than 4 to 1 within the 120 days. So the vast majority of people are taking 120 days to overhaul their cellular status and put themselves physiologically and biologically in a position to best benefit from those responses, those adaptations, that control of recovery that we know is available to them once that's achieved, once the level is reached, and then sustained. And it's really, really simple to do. So really, for all of that, as somebody who works within the space, that's what brought me to Zinzino, was to think, well, we have something that is so scientifically derived, research informed, that has such a potential effect across athletic populations, across our wider population in the context of health, which itself is vital. It's an essential part of what people should embrace. The way that people have been really switched on over the past few years to recognize vitamin C, vitamin D, having some better understanding of what protein in the diet does, having a better understanding why you can't and you shouldn't overindulge in carbohydrates. More and more of the language as we move forward, because we increase understanding as we go, is going to center upon how vital this is. It's been a key component to what's happened to our diet due to those massive dietary changes that have been brought about really since the late 1940s and 1950s. Now what we have is a clever, intelligent, sustainable solution to make it easy to achieve and easy to remain compliant indefinitely, which is exactly what people should do indefinitely. And compliance is the key to everything. You know, there's an old saying that is determination will get you there, but consistency will keep you there. And that definitely rings true across any of our dietary behaviors, as well as our exercise and training behaviors. So it's a simple, effective, sustainable solution. And it is quite simply, and you might say I'm biased to say this, but remember, I've only just joined, and these are the reasons why everyone wants to join the best team. It is without doubt class leading. There is nothing of its equivalent available. And we're in the process of evolving that and taking that even further forward. So I would encourage anybody who is looking at the context of how they can best manage their athletes, particularly in the terms of recovery and adaptation, to really do their due diligence and recognize the power of this with regards to how it's implicated in facilitating those other aspects of recovery. You know, that old school idea of going, just make sure we've got enough protein, that has, as we all know, that has a very limited return. Of course, protein's important. Protein's a vital aspect of the building block, but the building blocks are only one part. If there's no mortar, if there's no cement, if there's no plaster, if there's no foundations, you know, if we can't put a roof on it, then those bricks on their own, those blocks don't really count for much. And we're always looking for that 1%. And it's famous across sport now. And it actually predates David Brailsford, who's famous for saying it, you know, from the GB Cycling and Team Sky. But we're never looking for 100% in one area. We're looking for 1% in 100 areas. And actually, when it comes to your cellular status, you're probably getting way beyond 1%, way beyond 10, 15, 20%, because we are talking about a fundamental shift and change to our cellular status, which is one of the key aspects of our fundamental biology. So hopefully that will give you some kind of food for thought on what it is you need to consider. Please do look at the research. I'll say it one more time. I would direct you primarily towards Professor Chris McGlory over in Canada. He's done some incredible work. Go and have a look at that. From there, you will then quite quickly be directed into those real pockets of information where this sits. The balance oil is the most effective solution. The test confirms it for itself. It's scientifically derived, scientifically informed, and a really powerful tool to have in your box when you're thinking of the best outcomes for your athletes.